All right, guys, we are going to go ahead and get started. A couple small notes before we get into the PowerPoint. One, I may or may not have actually known how to spell the word segregation before I made this PowerPoint, so I apologize for the continuous typo in there. And then number two, one of the things I'm going to be doing in this PowerPoint presentation is comparing World War I to World War II constantly. And the reason why I'm going to be doing that, and the good thing for you to be thinking about, is that is the majority of what your classwork is on, is comparing the home front of World War I to World War II. So let's get started. I had a couple people ask me if I could go over the review at the beginning of the PowerPoint, so I'll do that just really quickly. All the following had some direct impact on the United States joining World War II directly, except for what? That would be D, the Holocaust. Which of the following had the biggest direct impact on the United States joining World War II? That would be the attack on Pearl Harbor, A. And then the bill which allowed FDR to sell, loan, or give war materials to countries for their defense against Axis forces was called what? That would be the Lend-Lease Act. And the way that you'd be able to tell that is the Lend-Lease Act compared to the cash and carry is that word loan. The cash and carry, they did not loan or give war supplies to anyone. You had to buy it. First thing I want to look at is World War II production. The production in World War II that the United States put out was the reason why the United States won World War II. We are going to outproduce our enemies so intensely, it's not even funny. I mean, by 1944, we're producing twice as much as Germany and Japan is combined. When you're making twice as many weapons as the two biggest countries you're fighting, you're probably going to win. And we would have won. This would have been a war of attrition. You know, if we had fought this war for 4 years or 10 years or 20 years, we would have won every time, not necessarily because of our military strategy or the soldiers, but just because of the amount of production that we had. If you look at this chart right here, this chart's trying to show you that if you look at all the money the U.S. made in the 1940s, we spent about 40 to 50% of it on the budget. That just shows a massive amount of money that we spent. If we were to do that today, we would have to increase our current our current budget from $4.5 trillion to about $9 to $10 trillion. We'd have to double our budget to try to equal it to what World War II was. Basically, everyone had a job, and basically everyone's job was to make war materials. Now, in looking at everyone having a job, it's really important to understand the labor relations during this time, because the labor relations between the U.S. and U.S. workers was unlike anything that we've ever had before or since. The U.S. government's going to basically take control of the U.S. economy in an unprecedented way. It's kind of a United States thing that the U.S. economy should work independently of the U.S. government. And that's not what happened during World War II. In World War II, there was this thing created called the War Production Board. And the War Production Board was a new government agency that basically organized what factories were going to make. So, famous example, Ford stopped making automobiles in the 1940s and instead started to make tanks. And the War Production Board was the one that decided that. Would you think about it, like, what a power move. It would be kind of like if we went from me teaching you U.S. history to me telling you today I'm going to teach you how to fire a gun, which would be kind of terrifying. Additionally, there were things that created like the War Labor Board, which basically stated that workers could not strike. If you struck, then that would be illegal. And this kind of goes back on the Wagner Act, which had only been created a couple years earlier, and people though basically went along with it because of high patriotism and people wanting to win the war. It also helped that when the War Labor Board was created, they gave everyone a 15% raise. And if you didn't comply to this, the U.S. government would seize your company. They created this thing called the Smith-Hawley Act, and this said that if you did not go along with what the U.S. was wanting, then they could seize your company. And they actually did that really with just one major company, but they threatened it with several others. So in comparison to World War I, the production output and the labor relationship was much different, but both did restrict freedoms, right? All of a sudden you couldn't strike with the War Labor Board, and you couldn't speak badly against the government with the Sedition Act and the Espionage Act of World War I. I should note that the Espionage Act from World War I was still around during World War II, although it wasn't as enforced nearly as intensely. Basically, as long as you weren't trying to stop the draft from happening, there was a military draft in World War II. They wouldn't arrest you for just kind of speaking out against it casually. So for the restrictions, rations were implemented in World War II just like they were for World War One. The rations didn't seem as bad during World War II, and partially that's because the Great Depression had made everyone so poor that they were used to not being able to buy whatever they wanted. And people were making money now, so they were basically just buying the same amount of goods that they had when they didn't have money. So taxes did spike. One of the easiest ways you can see this is through the highest tax bracket, which was 94%. What that meant was any amount that you made over $2.5 million, you were taxed at 94%. You only got to keep about 6% of it. So let's say you made $10 million from $2.5 million to $10 million would be about $7.5 million. Of that $7.5 million, you would only get to keep 375,000 of those dollars. Compare that to today. If you made $10 million from 2.5 million to 10 million, so again that's $7.5 million, you would get to keep about 4.7 of those $1 million. So it was a heavy tax bracket, and that was used to pay for the war. They also did these things called war bonds, and war bonds were basically where you would give money to the government. The government would say, we will pay you back in an approximate time. For the World War II war bonds, it was somewhere between 30 and 40 years. So it was a long time, but they would give you back a guaranteed amount. That's how they financed the war. Now we're going to look at a couple different people who were very active during World War II, different people groups. So the first is going to be women. World War II is a big coming out party for women in working positions. So World War One kind of started this. World War One did have women work in factories, and they were big contributions to that war effort, and it allowed for them to get the right to vote. But since then, we've had this revolution of women. The flappers have come around. Women are getting more educated, and then when World War II comes around, women are going to play even a bigger role. They're going to join the military. 300,000 join the military, and then they're going to become a massive part of this factory production. And one of the biggest differences between World War I and World War II is women worked in factories, but a lot of times they wouldn't work the heavy duty jobs. The men's work is what it was called. This would be working on the lines, using the heavy machinery, things like that. This time they are going to do that. Propaganda was created to try to get women to come to work. Now, women were still paid less, but the big thing to kind of note of this is after this, women are going to continue to work. After World War I, a lot of women went back home. A very small percentage continued to work. After World War II, there was an initial short of where women were pushed out of these factory jobs. Women came back home. But by 1947, the same amount of women that were working during World War II were now working in the U.S. economy. And this kind of begins the start of women truly working full-time in the U.S. economy. All right, for black people in World War II, what you want to know is this is the building block of the civil rights movement. I would actually consider World War II to be the first act of the civil rights movement. So black people did go fight in World War II. About 700,000 fought. Most of them did not have jobs as active duty soldiers. They would have to work in construction and have some of those off the front lines jobs. Only 2 combat divisions existed. Those are people who actually see military action, and that's because the military was still segregated. But black people are going to play such a huge role in World War II, and they are going to interact with white soldiers. And the more that black soldiers interact with white soldiers, the more that some of those racial barriers are going to come down. People are going to interact with black people who had never seen a black person, and that's going to cause for some of their racist point of views to slowly die out. We've already talked about the Fair Employment Act, which gave black people opportunities for jobs in the military industry. And so that's going to cause basically a second Great Migration of where people are going to move up. It's not quite as intense as World War I, but more black people are moving up to these northern cities for these factory jobs. And that's going to cause for them to get more involved in politics. The NAACP is going to see a 10% increase. And there was this thing created called the CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, and this was also to combat segregation. It should be noted that these guys who were fighting for civil rights at this point, they knew that they were doing this. The CORE created this campaign called the WW campaign, which was that people who were black should join the military, not just to go fight their foreign enemies, but also to fight racism. People really did see this as a way to try to gain equality, and it's going to prove that while it didn't come immediately, it did start the process. Two other minority groups that I want to talk about are Mexican Americans and Native Americans. Both of them also did fight in World War II. Not nearly as many served in World War II as black people, but they also weren't segregated, which is a little interesting. Native Americans served a pretty vital role. They were called code talkers, which is where Native Americans, specifically the Navajo, would speak their native language to one another through walkie-talkie, so that people who were listening in couldn't know what they were saying. Mexican Americans are going to develop tension in southwestern parts of the United States because they are going to move up there for farming jobs. And this created the Zoot Suit riots. So let me explain the Zoot Suit riots real quick. First, Zoot Suits were these horrible looking suits that people wore in the 1920s and 30s. They started at the Harlem Renaissance, and they were very popular among Mexican American young men in the 1940s. And there was a sailor who was beaten by someone he said was wearing a zoot suit. And so what happened was basically white people just went around starting to beat up every single person wearing a zoot suit. And it went on for days before it could eventually end. And it actually banned the zoot suits. And it's one form of prejudice and discrimination that we're going to talk about between Hispanics building up against white people in southwestern parts of the United States. So for propaganda during World War II, propaganda is going to look very, very different from World War II compared to World War I. So in World War I, the propaganda was super heavy-handed. If you remember, it displayed that the Germans were these monsters, that they were these Huns and guerrillas, and they needed to be put down. And this was a war to save all the wars and everything like that. And that really inspired a lot of young men to go fight. And that's actually a big fallout of World War I, is that all these young men came home and they felt like they didn't really make a difference, that the Germans weren't really that bad. And they became very disillusioned. It's one of the reasons actually why the United States became isolationist, because all these guys who went and fought in World War I, they weren't incredibly happy or proud that they had fought in World War I. So the United States decided to not make the same mistake again, and instead they created much more mild propaganda. And this was more of a war that was seen as being fought for democracy, or maybe being shown actually to fight just to protect your homeland, but nothing about ending the war of all wars, or that you were going to be this massive hero or anything like that. Now, propaganda was still created. It was actually this time though created by Hollywood, so that's one big difference. World War I, all the propaganda was really created by the U.S. government. World War II, U.S. government does create propaganda, but so does Hollywood. And Hollywood had some really interesting propaganda. There was one in particular that's Donald Duck, who's making fun of the Nazis, and this kind of just shows what the propaganda during that time period looked like. It was not nearly as heavy-handed or serious as the propaganda of World War I. Last thing I want to talk about is Executive Order 9066. This was issued by President Franklin Roosevelt. It's definitely the biggest black eye of Franklin Roosevelt during this time period, which is where Japanese Americans were put into these things called internment camps. About 100,000 Japanese were put in these camps, and these camps were isolated desert camps out west that basically imprisoned Japanese Americans for the duration of World War II. Most of these people, you have to understand, were U.S. citizens. They weren't even immigrants. They were born in the United States. They had their legal citizenship. They had to sell their homes, but because people knew that the Japanese were moving out to these desert camps, they had to sell their homes for a massive discount. They lost their businesses. And this was all because people had this massive fear and suspicion of immigrants during this time period. Not that different than World War I, but if you remember World War I, a lot of that fear and discrimination came towards the Germans or European immigrants, and it was because of communism or the ideas. This was much more racially motivated, where people basically felt like because you were from Japan, you were going to be a spy for the Japanese. Now, people did challenge this. Fred Korematsu, for example, went to before the Supreme Court and challenged this, and this is a bad look for the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is actually going to uprule the constitutionality of these internment camps. Now, in 1986, so 40 plus years later, the U.S. government is going to apologize for this and actually give every living person who was still around during the internment camps $20,000 tax-free for basically saying that they were sorry. And that did actually bring up a good debate about other people that deserve reparations or payments for previously historically bad things that happened to them. So Native Americans and African Americans have both brought up this idea that, well, it's not like the Japanese were the only people who ever got mistreated by the U.S. government. What about other people who were mistreated by the U.S. government? And the U.S. has mainly remained quiet about that ever since then. But the Executive Order 9066 was definitely one of the most intense things that happened during World War II at the home front. And it showed that the United States was still prone to racism towards the people they were fighting, just like World War I. For your classwork, I'm not going to really talk too much about A and B. I just want to look at C really quickly. For C, what you want to be able to do is you need to be able to make an argument if World War I and World War II benefited minorities or did not benefit minorities in the United States. And so for your answer would just basically say that you think that it did benefit or it did not benefit. Your cite is going to be an example of how it did benefit minorities or did not benefit minorities. And then your explain would be to show how your cite is a good example of it benefiting minorities or not benefiting minorities. Right? Good luck.